a wall. I hit a wall in just every part of my life. Be careful about attaching your identity too much to the success or failure of your company. When the company died, they died, or they wanted to die, and that's not healthy.
Welcome to the Founders Network podcast, where you get the real story, not the highlight reel. You'll hear the decisions, the doubts, and the messy middle of building startups. Today, you're going to hear my conversation with Chip Conley. Chip started his first boutique hotel at 26 with a funky motel in the Tenderloin of San Francisco called the Phoenix, and over the next 24 years, built it into a 52 hotel company. Then he had a near-death experience, sold the company, and got a call from Brian Chesky asking him to be his mentor at Airbnb. He was 52, Brian 31, the average age in the company, 26. This is a conversation about what happens after the first chapter. We get into identity, how attaching yourself too much to your company can be dangerous. Chip lost 3 entrepreneur friends to suicide during the Great Recession when their companies went under. We talked about emotional intelligence, how to empower your team instead of swooping in to be the hero, and the difference between being a librarian mentor and a confidant mentor. Then we got into his current chapter with Modern Elder Academy, where he's helping people in midlife figure out what's next. What I loved about this conversation with Chip is he was so open about hitting the wall, not wanting to run his company anymore, and rebuilding from there. That's what Founders Network's all about. It's founders helping founders for the long haul. Chip showing up to share his story with our community is exactly that. We do these conversations so you can see it to believe it. Chip's story is proof that the journey doesn't end when you sell. It's just a new chapter. If he can figure it out, so can you. So keep on building and never give up. Chip, thanks for doing this with us. All right. So good morning, Chip.
Good morning, Kevin.
All right.
I wish I was in the hood with you in Potrero Hill.
I know, your old stomping grounds.
So you could do it in person. Yeah.
I know. Well, it sounds like you have a much cooler day in store for you later today, meeting with Brian Wilson.
Yeah. The Dwight on The Office. He's been on my podcast, The Midlife Chrysalis, and I am on his podcast, Soul Boom, this afternoon.
Cool. It's a whole podcast tour.
Yeah,
well, welcome to the Founders Network podcast. This is our second ever recording, but we've been doing these for the last, probably since COVID, if not earlier. I mean, for the last 15 years of Founders Network, we've done a ton of webinars, even before it was cool, GoToMeeting, and then it was WebEx, and then we built our own using Twilio, and then everybody blamed us for the latency instead of GoToMeeting or WebEx, and then finally Zoom fixed it. And then we just decided, let's just do a conversation in Riverside and have like a little better product and a little more produced. So anyways, yeah, just to kind of catch you up. I don't know if you recall the context of our initial conversation. Okay, cool. I did read your book, the Midlife Manifesto.
The Midlife Manifesto. Okay. Yes.
Yeah. So I had that on my nightstand.
That doesn't take long.
Yeah, it was an easy one, but super cool. I've read like Transitions and some other books, over the years. I'm mid-40s and I love the concept of it. And I love the whole modern elder story and what you're doing now. And so I thought like we could have a conversation. This is Founders Network podcast. So it's for founders, obviously, tech founders. And you've got a lot of wisdom to share. And so we want to try to get those messages for the founders in the conversation. And I thought we could just start with, a little bit of more of an introduction from you of your background and your story. And then we kind of get into some of these key ideas that we want the founders to learn about.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, my career has 3 chapters. The first chapter was when I was 26, a couple of years out of Stanford Business School. And I started one of the world's first boutique hotel companies. And it was based in San Francisco. And over the course of the next 24 years running that company, we went from one funky motel in the Tenderloin called the Phoenix to 52 hotels around California. After where you are right now, I just hit a wall. I hit a wall in every part of my life and didn't want to do it anymore. It was the Great Recession. So I really couldn't run away from my business and I couldn't sell it very easily. And so I just strapped myself in and dealt with 2 years of really difficult times and got to the other side of it. I sold the company. Joie is now called JDV, and it's a Hyatt brand. So I had a little bit of time between 50 and 52 to think about what was next for me. I enjoyed my entrepreneurial journey, but I also had felt at times like my sense of identity was too attached to the company, which is a very much of a familiar kind of thing for a lot of founders, especially founders in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. I do think that as we get older, we realize that our life is much more than just our business card or our company identity. And so I spent 2 years between 50 and 52 doing sort of a deep dive on what made me curious in life. I was the first founding board member of Burning Man. Who knew Burning Man had a board? And so I was
It is a surprising fact.
Yeah, long history with Burning Man, and the founders had asked me to be their first board member, and I joined, so I was really curious about festivals of all kinds. So I spent between 50 and 52 going to festivals all over the world. I went to 36 festivals in 16 countries, festivals of all kinds, including religious pilgrimages. I mean, just really interesting stuff. I got really interested in emotions because I really struggled with my emotions in my late 40s, and I wrote a book called Emotional Equations that became a New York Times bestseller. And I was also curious with hot springs. So as I went around the world checking out the world's best hot springs. So I really sort of rewarded myself from 50 to 52. But at 52, I got a call from Brian Chesky, the co-founder and CEO of a little tech startup I'd barely heard of. This was in late 2012. The company was really quite small, and most people had never heard of it. And so Brian said he wanted me to be his mentor, but also in-house, like full-time. And I couldn't do full-time initially, but I did move into full-time quickly. Ultimately, he called me his modern elder, which I said, like, fuck you. I didn't like the term. It was like, I'm not elderly, but I was 52 and he was 20. He was 31. The average age in the company was 26. Yeah, relatively speaking, I was an elder. And then he said to me the thing that really got to me, which was like, he said, Chip, a modern elder is someone who's as curious as they are wise. And I was like, wow, that's what I want to be when I grow up. The combination, the alchemy of curiosity and wisdom. And so I spent 7.5 years there, 4 years full-time, 3.5 years part-time, helping the company go to its IPO when it became the most valuable hospitality company in the world. And during that time, I started percolating a new book in my head, which is called Wisdom at Work, The Making of a Modern Elder. And while I was writing that book down in Baja, where I had a home on the beach, I one day went for a run on the beach and I had a Baja aha, an epiphany. And the epiphany was, why are there no places for people in their 40s and 50s? As it turns out, it's a broader collection of people who come to MEA now. But why isn't there not a place for people in their 40s and 50s to reimagine and repurpose themselves? I could have used it. I certainly could have used it. And yeah, I lost 5 male friends to suicide between 2008 and 2010, and 3 of the 5 were entrepreneurs. And so that was during the Great Recession. So I thought, God, this is something that's needed in the world. And so I started the Modern Elder Academy, MEA, and we now have over 8,000 alumni from 60 countries, and we have 56 regional chapters. And about a quarter of the people who come to MEA are millennials, who are really interested in looking at how do you develop your own wisdom and how you develop wisdom on a leadership team. So that's my not so brief intro.
I mean, it's an incredible journey, and you've done a lot in this sort of second act after the hotel part of your journey, the first 20 plus years coming out of Stanford Business School. I wonder if we can talk about that a little bit and dive into it, because I think that's kind of the formative experience, I guess, that sets you up for this midlife second act, right? And diving into these topics around emotional intelligence and curiosity and wisdom. For those 20 plus years, like, we talk to a lot of founders here who are 20-year overnight success stories, right? And resilience and just never giving up. And sometimes you talk to them and they say, hey, I wish like I could have just shut down at 10 years and started a new thing and done another one. Do you have any reflections on that part of your journey that like you wish you would have known then that you know now, maybe that would be relevant for a founder who's 8 or 10 years in?
It's really hard. My friend Seth Godin, who I went to business school with, and, we are close friends for 40 years now. Or actually 40, almost 45 years now. He had a book called The Dip. And the whole premise of the dip is when you go through a dip, whether it's a financial dip for the company, an emotional dip for yourself, how do you know you're coming out of it? And, for me, it was Joie, my boutique hotel company, we had the .com bust 9/11, which was a big dip, especially for hotels in the Bay Area. And then we had after we got out of that, we had a couple good years, and then we went into the Great Recession. And during that first dip, I felt like a gladiator. I really did. I felt like I was learning. I had a curiosity about, okay, what can we learn from this? I felt like a leader that people wanted to work with. I felt like a magnet, and we did really well. I ultimately wrote a book called Peak: How Great Companies Get Their Mojo from Maslow, based upon that experience. And I really built a business philosophy around that. But what I can say is that when I went into the Great Recession, I was already going through an emotional dip. I was already in a place where I didn't really want to be running this company anymore. And I had a long-term relationship ending. And I have a African-American foster son who was an adult who was going to prison wrongfully. And I was losing friends to suicide, and I was running out of cash. And then I had an NDE, a near-death experience. because an allergic reaction to an antibiotic. So, I was like, okay, how many things, like I can have grit
Is
and
that all?
I can have grit and resilience, but at some point, I didn't feel like a gladiator. I felt like a gladiator during the dot-com bust, but I did not feel like
Yeah.
a gladiator. I felt like a prisoner.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that a friend of mine who's a coach said to me, she said, Chip, why did you start Joie de Vivre in the first place? And that was over 20 years earlier. And I was like, oh, well, I think it was because of the creativity and the freedom. And she said, do you still have that? And I was like, no, not at all. And she said, is that still really important to you? I said, yeah, it is really important. It's not the only thing that's important. Back then, it might have been the primary thing, but it's really important to me. And she said, well, then how do we get creativity and freedom back in your life? And she asked that about a week before I had my flatline experience. And it was like, okay. And I was really stumped by the question. I did not know how I could get creativity and freedom back in my life, because at that point I was just bailing water from a sinking ship during the Great Recession. We launched 15 hotels over 21 months between the end of 2000, mid 2000, or summer 2009, which was not a good time to be launching a bunch of new hotels. And so the NDE really woke me up and just said, and I don't think everybody has to have an NDE to like make a change in your life. You can come to MEA for that with it. Lot less stressful. But I think what I really got from it was this idea that, if creativity and freedom was so important to me, and I think I really am, I'm a creative person, I'm an innovative person, but I now feel like I'm stuck. Maybe I need to bring somebody in. And so I did elevate my COO to president, but I didn't really have a CEO candidate. And I really just knew that, okay, I think this chapter of my life is done. And even though I was so identified with, I was like a mini version of Richard Branson. So Richard Branson, Virgin would not be the same without Richard Branson, right? So Joie de Vivre, the way people would say to me, like, Joie de Vivre would not be the same without you. So I was like, I'm so stuck. I'm attached. And for a lot of my career, that ego attachment gave me a lot of perks. But by the time I got to this age, the age of my late 40s, the perks didn't matter anymore. What really mattered was I wanted to be able to wake up in the morning and not worry about how we were making payroll that week. And so I had to get to a place where I just realized that, okay, I can find creativity and freedom somewhere else. I just need to land this plane. And that was my job for 2 years, was to just to a place where I could, without bankruptcy, I could sell the company. I sold the management company and the brand to a guy named John Pritzker, whose family started Hyatt, and then ultimately he sold Joie de Vivre to Hyatt. But I was able to sell it. I kept my ownership of the real estate, which was very smart, because over the next few years, after that Great Recession, the real estate of the hotels that we owned went way up. So I made a lot of money on that, but I didn't make a ton of money. After 24 years and 3 years in a row of not taking a salary, when I sold it for enough money to feel good, but not enough money to feel great. But thank God, I kept the real estate, and thank God for Airbnb, because that really, I made a
That worked out.
Yeah.
It sounds like, everybody has a different story, but in your case, you kind of got into it for certain reasons, and it happened to be about, hotels, but it was really this creativity and this freedom. And at a certain point that ended.
Yeah. I mean, the process of launching, 52 boutique hotels over 24 years was exhilarating.
It's a lot. Yeah.
It's a lot, and I loved it. And we had a process for doing it that was, got a lot of attention, and we were innovating and getting a lot of attention for what we were doing. And it was very creative, but it was sort of like, I like making babies. I just don't want to raise them.
That's great.
And it was 52 hotels plus 23 restaurants plus 6 spas. I mean, it was over 80 businesses.
I see. Yeah. So each one is this creative act. And then there's the operations side. So maybe the takeaway for founders is just kind of understanding what kind of founder you are. Are you the one that likes to birth new things, or are you the one that likes to be the steady hand and and usually you're the former, not the latter.
That's true. And I had skills in both. I mean, thank God I had this, I had some business school background, so I could run the company, but that was not where my joy was, for sure. And so I probably should have run a branding agency, and that's what I should do.
Yeah.
But, the nice thing about actually being the CEO of a company that was creating the hotels is, if I was a branding agency, I could make all these recommendations, but who knows if the clients actually, so I had I had the freedom, so that, creativity and freedom, the freedom to do the things that I was cooking up in my brain. But I also would say another lesson from all this is be careful about attaching your identity too much to the success or failure of your company. To lose 5 friends, but 3 of them entrepreneurs,
Yeah.
all 3 of their companies went under during the Great Recession. It was almost like their sense of identity of who they were was, 100% attached to their company. When the company died, they died, or they wanted to die, and that's not healthy, obviously. And there's a Rudyard Kipling poem called "If,"
Mm.
and it's about the idea, don't your worst and your best days, don't judge your life based upon those. And it's a beautiful poem that every entrepreneur or founder should read.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I'll have to check that out. This idea that founders tend to attach themselves with their startup. You are your startup, and then losing friends probably because of that, right? And the hidden costs of doing a startup, of this career choice. I think of it like a vocation or a calling. Once you do one startup, you want to do another, and that's the vision of FN as a lifelong support group for founders. As much as it's tactical A to B, it's emotional runway and cathartic kind of venting and having a group that understands you. So this very much is what Founders Network's about. It's very much about my experience doing a startup, experiencing burnout, and having a friend pass away that really just changed the course of my life to start Founders Networks. Everything you're saying, it really resonates. And I think it helps you focus in on what matters. And then, what's interesting too about what you're saying is, yes, you're not your startup, and don't judge yourself on your worst or your best days. And then the other end of it too, if you're not attached enough to it, right? Maybe this is for the millennial audience. Like you're not going to succeed in a startup if you're not vested in it. So what do you think the right kind of asterisk is on that statement of like, how much of you goes into this?
Well, I think that's a good question.
Yeah.
First of all, learning how to have a team supporting you is essential. I've learned that with Modern Elder Academy with MEA. But when I was, CEO and founder of Joie, I didn't really groom a successor. I sort of had one in the wings, but he was really young and he was a little brash and didn't really have the humility needed for the company. So when I had my NDE, I just realized, I've not prepared the company well in case something happens to me. Today, I have. So I think having a team of people is really essential. Number 2 is, whether you have a co-founder or partners, leaning on them and making sure that they have their skill set that is reciprocal to yours, that they're not redundant to yours. And so essential because every company is going to have some era where the operations piece is really important, or the sales piece is really important, or the going out and raising money, or the capital piece is important. If you think that you can do all of that exceptionally well, then you're a better person than me.
Yeah.
You really need those experts in those areas, whether they're co-founders or whether they're just senior leaders, and you need to empower them. I love, one of my favorite phrases is give people a reputation to live up to. So you hire people based upon their potential and their experience, and what you want them to do over time is to live up to that potential. So one of my favorite questions as a founder and a CEO to ask my direct reports is, how can I support you to do the best work of your life here at Joie de Vivre, Airbnb, or MEA? How can I support you to do the best work of your life here at whichever company? That question's a really important question, because what it does is it helps the people around you realize you want them to do their best work. You want them to be successful, but it also puts agency in their lap to say, your job is to tell me what you need to be successful. And it allows you as the leader to sort of give some responsibility to them, to have accountability and agency. And then you have to listen to them. And they may come up with 24 different ideas of what they need, and you may be able to only do 10 of them, but at least you're having the conversation. And so I have found that question to be really helpful. It also helps people to step up. And when people know, I want you to do the best work of your life here, then sometimes people have said to me, if I'm going to do the best work of my life, you got to give me some more responsibility. You've got to give me some more agency to make decisions. Sometimes you swoop in, Chip, and you become the hero, saving the day.
Mm-hmm.
And while they wouldn't say it, but I will, my ego was stroked in the process of doing that. That was one of the things I had to teach Brian Chesky. at Airbnb. It was I had seen it in myself. Is I love to come into a
Yeah.
meeting.
Yeah.
Like, for me, it was coming into a design meeting with the designers and the concepting people and naming the hotels and a new hotel and the branding. And I'd swoop in, having not been part of the earlier meetings, and like do things. Brian did exactly the same thing at Airbnb,
Hmm.
but it
Hmm.
wasn't boutique hotel design. It was the UX and the UI for the Airbnb website or a marketing campaign we were doing. And I was laughing early on because I was like, wow, I've seen this picture before. And my
Yeah.
job, that's why I was, his mentor, and the wise one was to be able to take him aside, not interrupt him in the meeting, but
Yeah.
take him aside and say, you know what, are you open to some advice or some feedback about how that meeting went? And, I would say in some of these meetings, I would say something like, you could have engineered that meeting a little differently so that your VP of marketing could have actually stepped up and had the solution. But instead, you supplied the solution. And
Mm.
then it took away that agency and that sense of pride that person had, that they could have actually gotten there. You
Mm.
could ask some questions as a
Yeah.
just delivering answers. But if you're like Brian or me, in our jobs, we are so fucking efficient, excuse me, but we're so fucking efficient of like, I got to go to the next meeting.
Yeah.
And I don't want to wait for the punchline. I want to tell you what the punchline is.
All right. This is where we transition to the founder mode topic. But, I think to put a cap on the first 20 plus years of your career, you are not your startup. And that also means empower others and groom others to help you with this effort as a key takeaway for you and for other founders, like this VP of marketing with Brian Chesky that you mentioned as well, right? And what it makes me think about is how we're control freaks as founders and how we can get really myopic. And that to me connects with your friends who passed away. Is part of that identifying with the startup is you're just too myopic and deep in and tight and focused around the startup, and some practice of zooming out, of letting go and stepping back from it. You had a coach that helped you with that in that transition to your festival years. Did you have a coach all the way through with
No, I
it was a
really
later
didn't.
thing?
It was my friend Vanda, the coach, really stepped in after my NDE. And it was during those last 2 years after that that we were selling I was going to figure out how to groom the company to be sold, where she was really helpful. Doesn't mean she hadn't done some things. She had actually done some leadership retreats with us and things like that, but she hadn't been sort of an ongoing coach. I will say that I was in YPO back then, and I was in a forum, and in my forum, I got a lot of help. So I think Founders Network is spectacular because it creates the crucible for really, important, deep conversations. And sometimes those conversations are about like things that are not going well. And one of the challenges with the founder world often, especially in the Bay Area, is this sense that you want to present a confident
The
and
success theater. Yeah.
the success theater, and quietly inside, you're just quaking in your boots. You're really nervous about the state of things, and who do you talk to about that? And in a intimate peer-to-peer network kind of format, you can have those conversations. But even better with those people than with a coach. And a coach can be helpful. I mean, there's some great coaches out there, but a lot of times a coach has never been in your shoes. Most coaches I know have never been an entrepreneur or a founder. As such, they don't really completely understand. Now, if all they do is they do like Edward Sullivan, I love the guy, velocity coaching. I teach with him. In fact, we're teaching together at our Baja campus in early March. He has been a founder, but he's also been around enough founders at this point. He understands the psychology of the founder. And he doesn't just listen for what the person's saying. He listens for what they're not saying.
Hmm.
And that's where it really gets interesting, is your blind spots. And so who sees your blind spots, whether it's a coach, whether it's your spouse, whether it's your co-founder, whether it's your best friend, whomever it is, we as entrepreneurs need people to point out our blind spots. Now, that's not easy. And it's really easy to react to that. And learning how to take a space between stimulus and response, and when someone's telling you something that's not easy to hear, if you can believe that they are saying this for your best interests, then that helps. Now, if they're not, I mean, if they're like someone who's trying to take over the company from you or whatever, that's a whole different story. But I would say the majority of the time when someone's giving you that feedback, they may be giving it to you for your best, for you, for what's best for you. And you may not agree with it, but be careful about the reaction. Take it under advisement. Say like, you know what? I hear you. Here's what I'm hearing from you. Are you open to actually sending something to me in email? Because like I'm hearing your words right now and I feel like I'm sort of like a pinball in a pinball machine. And I just sort of want to like read what you've just said to me. So send me something so that I can read it and just like take it in.
Yeah.
Because I really want to try to hear what you're saying. And right now I'm maybe not hearing it the way you want me to. Now, someone who can do that is emotional intelligence.
Mm.
And emotional intelligence is, 2/3 of the success of business leaders is their EQ as opposed to their IQ or their level of experience in the job.
Yeah, I think the best founders have this coachability, and that was your role at Airbnb, was really coaching Brian
Yeah,
Chesky, and
that's part of my role. I mean, I was also running part of the company. I mean, I was running a big part of the company, and so I had an actual operating role, which frankly was not my original plan. My original plan was I was going to mentor.
couldn't help yourself.
Well, I was going to mentor the 3 founders. It was going to be 15 hours a week, and then about 3 to 4 weeks into it, I had been sucked into 15 hours a day. And I said to Brian, like, okay, you got to start paying me because initially I was doing it for free. And I was like, you got to start paying me, and I'll clear the decks. I can see this is a rocket ship, and I need and want to help you steer the rocket ship, and I got to do that full time. So I changed everything, and then I went on a world tour, which was really interesting,
Hmm.
where I went around the world to I think 14 different markets. This is also at the same time I was doing my festival tour. I was finishing my festival tour as I was starting my Airbnb tour, going to see hosts. My job was to go around the world and listen to hosts. And I came back with an amazing 10 lessons that Brian and Joe and Nate were like, wow, they would never tell us these things because we're the founders.
Mhm.
And you didn't just tell us what the hosts are saying. You also said, here's the plan for each one, how we're going to solve each one of these 10 things. And that's when Brian said, like, okay, you're head of hospitality for the company. We already knew that, but like now you're the head of strategy for the company too. And it's like, okay. But I'm also your mentor. But I reported to Brian. Let's be honest. I was mentoring Brian, but I was the head of global hospitality and strategy. And so I was reporting to my mentee who was 21 years younger than me. And I really needed to right size my ego in order to do that. And my job became not getting my name in the lights, which is what I did quite often when I was at Joie de Vivre. But my job was to make sure when Brian's name was in the lights, and it was a lot, was to make sure that he lived up to the leadership reputation he was building. And I'm proud, over 5 years after the IPO, and is still leading as a CEO, Fortune 500 company that is still the most valuable hospitality company in the world. And he has his faults for sure. But for somebody who had zero background in business and started this just 2 years out of Rhode Island School of Design, I pleased to see he's still running the show.
Yeah, something worked there, I think. What did you learn about being a mentee, being a mentor? We talked about coachability and EQ. That's a shift. I also want to touch on your world tour and like the importance of talking to customers, and how did you get them to give you information that they wouldn't give the founders? I mean, was it just a title thing, or is there a
Alcohol.
alcohol tried and true?
In the Asian countries, in
Yeah.
Seoul and Tokyo, and it did help. Beijing as well. Long story short is, I think what I learned from my experience with Brian was I was a mentor. I was a mentor and an intern at the same time. I joined a tech company at age 52 and never worked in a tech company before. So I didn't understand the lingo. I was a boomer surrounded by millennials. I really had to adapt and learn about venture capital because I'd never dealt with venture capital and as a hotelier. So it was an opportunity for me to learn. And I had to have enough humility to be open to saying, I'm the dumbest person in the room right now. And I'm here to learn. I'm going to be curious. At the same time, I was a mentor when it came to emotional intelligence and leadership and strategy and, recruiting and culture. So, it was a symbiotic relationship between me and Brian. And, as of 2027, according to the US Department of Labor, the majority of Americans will have a younger boss. The majority of Americans. So we've never seen that before. So I got to sort of see a flavor of what was coming. So I would say that is a key lesson. I think another lesson that was that when it comes to mentorship, there's two kinds of mentors. There's the librarian, and the librarian has all the know who, and a librarian answers questions. And most of the people I mentored were that looking for that kind of mentor. And then there's the confidant, which is the more in-depth kind of mentor, which is my job is not to answer questions. My job is to ask questions. And my job is to give you confidence. So a confidant gives you confidence. And so I realized that when I was talking to someone in the company and they wanted me to be a mentor, I needed to size them up and say like, okay, is this a librarian relationship where I'm just answering questions, or is this the more in-depth kind of relationship where I'm asking the questions? And that was a great experience. When it came to the world tour and all of that, I'd say what helped was what I think was going on was the founders wanted to hear things. They didn't necessarily want to hear the bad news. They sort of wanted to have some kind of rah-rah out there in the host community that gave them the confidence that they were on the right path. And so that could be self-selecting. So if somebody was showing up at a host event in Rome to actually complain about something, what often happened and what I heard and then saw is the guys would listen, but then they'd actually bring somebody else in because it would get in the weeds pretty quickly about what was going on that was frustrating, and they wanted someone else to solve it, and they didn't have time to go into the weeds. And in the early days of being there, I had the time to go into the weeds, and I had the time to really, and even though a lot of what was going on was tech related. So again, I didn't understand tech very well, but the key thing was I listened. So the key thing was I was there to listen. Number two is I had the credibility of being a long time hospitality leader. And there were three primary complaints that I was hearing. One, over time, that got much worse was regulatory wise, but in the early days, it was not so much regulation. But the two key things were tech issues, which I needed to learn and understand how are we going to solve those. But the bigger one was like, no one had ever taught them any hospitality as hosts and as entrepreneurs. And so what are the moments of truth? And so from that experience, I realized how much, and we had some caution too, because as a third-party platform, we could not force people to go through an education process. Otherwise, we put them in the direction of potentially being employees as opposed to independent hosts. And so I had to, we had a little bit of a balancing beam. Yeah. But after that experience, I came back, presented to the senior leadership team and the founders and the board, and then went on another educational tour. And that was the CHIPS Hospitality Moments of Truth tour. And that's where I was really teaching them hospitality. And we had to make sure that we didn't force anybody to do anything. You weren't like, but we had to say like, the Superhost program, which had been on life support and which we were getting rid of. And I said, like, why would we only have 200 Superhosts in the world and they're our best hosts. Why would we get rid of it? It's like, well, we don't have the tech to sort of like support it. And everybody's like going in. I said, Superhost this is psychology. People want to be a Superhost when they grow up. Superhost is our way of telling our guests, this is a better listing. It's our way of telling our hosts, if you do these few things, you are actually going to become a super host, and then you're going to actually have you're going to show up more, in a search. So, I mean, so much of what I was doing was really psychology.
Yeah. That's the word that was on my mind as you were saying that. Yeah. And it might be missed in an engineering mindset. This is super fascinating. Moments of truth. The moments of truth you mentioned. Is that something you developed at Joie to Vivre, or?
Yeah, we did have moments of truth there. So the moments of truth are basically, this could be for any business. I'll explain it for Airbnb in a second, but it's those times when a potential customer or an existing customer is most likely to judge whether they made a good decision or a bad decision as to being a customer. So for example, in the Airbnb flow, a moment of truth for a potential customer would be seeing a listing for the first time. Not Airbnb, but now you're on Airbnb. We're talking about, okay, how do you deal with the host moment of truth? So the first one is, okay, but what are the best practices of creating your listing, and especially with accuracy. Accuracy is a really important piece because frankly, if you don't get the accuracy thing right, you create problems later when the person shows up and like, hey, this is not what your pitch. So that was, that point. Then there's other moments of truth, including a moment of truth of like when something goes wrong. Back in the day, as a hotelier, one of my favorite things is to actually turn someone around from being a terrorist to a cheerleader, in terms of a customer where something went really wrong. And then we turn them around because that customer is usually more loyal and more of an evangelist to their friends than the customer for whom everything went right.
Hmm.
So yeah, hospitality is an
Yeah.
amazing training ground for understanding how do you address customers in a way where they feel heard and seen and cared for. And I was really proud because when I joined Airbnb, our net promoter score, NPS, which a lot of companies use, was about half of the hotel industries. And when I left uh, Airbnb, we were about 40% higher than the hotel industry. And that was so much of that was helping the hosts understand how to deliver amazing hospitality and to see that as entrepreneurs, it's in their best interest to do so.
Hmm.
And that's the key is where we had to create the incentives, the carrot and the stick. Number one is the carrot. We had to have the incentives like Superhost and things like that, that encouraged hosts to do their best. But we also had to have the stick. And that was a hard one for me when I first joined because nobody on the platform wanted to get rid of bad hosts. We spent a lot of money and time to get hosts,
Hmm.
get bad ones. And I was like, okay, well then we got to train them. Well, we can't train them, Chip, because if we train them and send them to, remedial school, then they become employees. So it was a really interesting dance for me because quality, I would say that one of my biggest responsibilities in the days at Airbnb was quality.
Yeah.
How do we get Airbnb to a place where people see it as potential quality? And I always said like, okay, it's not about being the most consistent. That's Holiday Inn. Holiday Inn will be consistent. We need to be dependable. And the difference between consistency and dependability is consistency suggests it's the same thing over and over again, which is boring. And that's what a chain hotel does. But dependability is you expect something, disappointment equals expectations minus reality. How do we make sure that we manage expectations properly? And how does the host do that with a listing? How does Airbnb do it? And then when reality is less than expected, how do we come back? And it's hard to do that in a global platform, growing as quickly as Airbnb was.
Yeah. It's interesting. So much of entrepreneurship is just expectation management.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And and so I love these frameworks. I'm cognizant of time and I want to make sure we talk about, like we did with Joie de Vivre, if the Airbnb era, like if you look back at it as something that's with you today, that if you would think about your earlier self as a founder for our audience, you've already shared so many good things. Is there anything else that comes up for you for like, I know that the founder mode topic made the waves, recently, and this fine line that you walk as a founder of enabling, empowering, giving people expectations that they can live up to. But is there anything else that kind of comes up for you that you think is kind of a
Yeah, I would say
instructive or yeah.
last the only I would say, which was why Brian and I got along so well, was a clear alignment around culture, especially for a culture like Airbnb, which was global. By the time I got there, we had offices around the world already, and we were like a 4-year-old company. By the time I left, we had offices in 22 different countries around the world. And so, how you create a culture that is global and tangible, and we as a company, and to Brian and Joe and Nate's credit, we invested a lot in culture. We did something called One Airbnb every year, which we brought all people from all over the world to a 4-day festival, like a love fest at our Airbnb headquarters in San Francisco. And, that was expensive to do. And so, yeah, the idea that people understood what they were getting themselves into when they joined, and the culture evolved over time, and that we were investing in culture, all of that was really important.
Yeah. Yeah. That's often overlooked and it's hard to do remotely as well. Very cool. And then your more recent chapter with Modern Elder, and you've published some books along the way, and I want to make sure we go a little bit more in depth on that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I love writing books. I've written 8 books. Many of them have been at the intersection of psychology and business. More recently, they've been more sort of psychology and, age related. I was created as, based upon that idea that I had when I went for a run on the beach, which was, why is it that we don't have places where people can reimagine and repurpose themselves, navigate the transitions of midlife? I define midlife as 35 to 75, so it's a pretty broad definition. Cultivate purpose, learn how to own your wisdom, and reframe your relationship with getting older and see the upside of it. Because Becca Levy at Yale has shown that when you shift your mindset on aging from a negative to a positive in midlife, you gain 7.5 years of additional longevity. So for all those reasons, MEA got started. We have 2 campuses, one in Baja on the beach, right where I had my original concept come the epiphany, Baja Aja. And then we have a 2,600 acre campus in Santa Fe, New Mexico. That's a regenerative horse ranch. And we have residential communities too. We have regenerative communities where people live around regenerative farms and things like that. So it's a big, bold idea, and I've been enjoying it. What's nice about it relative to my Joie de Vivre era and even the Airbnb era, it was like it's all my own money. So I've poured tens of millions of dollars into it, and I don't really have anybody to answer to except for myself. And I really appreciate that, having dealt with partners and investors and
Yeah.
owners of hotels we managed, and then also at Airbnb with the Airbnb ride on the investor side was pretty good, other than what happened with the pandemic. But Airbnb, after a really big dip in business, saw that the pandemic was great because the
Yeah.
hotel industry fell apart and people got an Airbnb for a month or two, and
Hmm.
they saw that the platform allowed them to flee urban markets and go to Airbnbs in all over the world and then hunker down. So yeah, I think I've learned a lot along the way. The other thing I've learned with MEA is I've moved from return on investment ROI to ripple of impact. And I think I started doing that at Airbnb. And so the premise there being is like, okay, the transactional side of running a business, you're focused on, the return on investment, of course. But as you get older, you move from, building your resume and your LinkedIn profile to starting to develop what people will say about you at your eulogy. And so the idea of the ripple of impact is something that became very clear to me at Airbnb. But now having a school with, over 8,000 students that have gone through our programs, it's really clear that the greatest reward as we get older is to see that ripple of impact, because that is so much more than, frankly, the financial side. Now, it does help that I had the return on investment financial benefit of doing what I've done in my life, even though, frankly, if you'd asked me at age 50 when I sold my company for not a lot of money, I felt a bit like a loser. But, I didn't know that Airbnb was coming along. I didn't
Mm.
know that, the hotels that I still owned would come back in value and I could sell them for a lot of money. And now I've invested that, in something that to me feels like it's going to last beyond my time on this earth.
Mm. It's fantastic. So the idea is that there's this sort of gap of like, and not a lot of thinking or focus. You get old and you die. But there's there's a lot of concepts in the manifesto that I think are really important concepts for midlife founders. Founders Network tends to be founders that have, it's a lifelong network. So we've got founders that are kind of in that period of their lives. I know that a lot of them deal with like feeling like there's ageism, feeling like, maybe you need to be 18 to 24 to start a company.
There's ageism on both sides, though. I mean, there's
Yeah.
to be, ageism toward a younger person. So
Yeah.
ageism, I want to be really clear. I think that
Yeah.
ageism cuts in both directions. But on the older side, a famous executive recruiter once said to me, Chip, if a person shows up with curiosity and a passionate engagement for what they do, they won't notice your wrinkles. They'll notice your energy. And people are drawn to energy. And so I'm 65 years old. I still have a lot of energy, and people are drawn to energy. And so, especially if you're older and you're showing up with energy, you're playing against type. People think, after 45 or after 50, you're not going to be open to new ideas or be curious or, have energy. If you can play against type, people will be drawn to you.
Yeah. I love that. Energy is what, people are following regardless of age. And you talk about age fluidity and all of these concepts are, I guess the question I have is do you have a lot of entrepreneurs that come to Modern Elder? Is it
That entrepreneurs are a big part of our business. And sometimes they're coming because they've sold a business and they're like, oh my God, I don't know who I am anymore.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's because they've had a business, go bad. Sometimes it's they're stressed and feeling like they need wisdom. I mean, because we're a wisdom school, a midlife wisdom school, I think the greatest benefit that a lot of our founders get is understanding how to develop wisdom in yourself and in your team. And so we have these wisdom management practices and these wisdom workshops. They're specific to that, and those are really popular. But also the workshops that are focused on people who have sold and they just don't know who they are now. What's next? Who am
Yeah, you
I?
hear that a lot. Yeah.
That's a huge one.
Yeah. You at 50.
Yes,
It was kind of that. You're building it for yourself at that point in your life. Yeah.
that's right.
And when they come to this, they can expect to walk away with a practice for developing wisdom and making sense of their experience.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So how often do you do these? What would founders
We
and
do
founders of our
120
community?
workshops a year. We do.
Okay.
We do. We have workshops happening every single week of the year at both campuses. Plus, we have two retreat centers at the Santa Fe campus, so we have even more there. And then we do a lot of private retreats. And sometimes companies come to us as a leadership team and to say, hey, we want to become a wise company as opposed to just a smart company, because quite frankly, all the world's knowledge is on my phone now. And so the question is, if knowledge has become a commodity, maybe wisdom is scarce and it's even more valuable. And so how do you create wisdom management practices?
I love that. Well, it sounds like a fantastic thing for any founder in transition as they sell their company and really at any point where they're in the midlife. And the sooner you know this, the better, I think, right?
Exactly.
All right. I think I have like one final question for you, Chip.
Yes.
You mentioned how many festivals was it? 36 festivals?
36 festivals. Yeah.
All right. Which festival should everybody attend?
Well, other than Burning Man, I mean, I went to the Maha Kumbh Mela, which is, an Indian festival on the Ganges River. That's every 12 years with 100 million people when I went in 2013. That's a once in a lifetime experience. I think anybody in the US, New Orleans Jazz Fest is not just about jazz. It's about a community celebration. And I love that one. The Telluride Film Fest is the best film festival in the world, in my opinion. Yeah, there's lots more.
That's great. Well, you got to have fun along the way. That's a really important part of this. Chip, thanks so much for dropping into Founders Network. I appreciate you. Thanks for taking the time. And we'll make sure we share what you're doing, the good work with Modern Elder, with the community. And hopefully this will be we'll have many more conversations in the future.
Thank you. Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah. Thanks, Chip.